3 nights ago. That's when all of this started. We were on a night out in a nearby town, celebrating one of my friend's birthdays. Me, Emily, Dan, and the birthday girl, Claire. We'd been out for hours, moving from bar to bar before settling in our favourite club. The drinks were flowing, the music was blaring, we were dancing and just having a good time in general. Although my memory of it is a little hazy now, I knew it was a great night. There was only one low point that stood out. It was only a little thing, but I'd gotten into a bit of an altercation with someone at one of the bars. Claire was on the dance floor, just vibing to the music, when this drunken idiot wandered over and started giving her some clearly unwanted attention. I could see in Claire's eyes, as she stared at me from across the bar while trying to get away from that creep, that she was uncomfortable. So I stepped in, positioning myself between Claire and the drunk. He threatened me, waving a finger in my face and calling me every name under the sun. When I didn't budge, he even went as far as to try and take a swing at me. Thankfully, this was relatively early on in the night, and I wasn't too drunk, which was more than I could say for him. His fist went wide, missing its mark completely. I shoved him in retaliation, sending him reeling backwards as he attempted to haphazardly regain his balance. Finally catching himself, he went to make his way back over to me, fire burning in his eyes, before his friends grabbed him and dragged him away. The air was filled with shouts of, "Leave it, mate, it's not worth it," and "Come on, man, let's go," as he was led from the bar out into the streets, all the while his eyes were locked on mine, staring daggers. Above the shouts of his friends, I could hear him yelling in a slurred voice, "You'll regret that, mate. You don't know who you're messing with." Not paying it any mind, the guy was clearly off his face, I turned back to check on Claire. She was obviously shaken by the whole thing, but was ultimately glad that he was gone. We all tried our best to put that incident to the back of our minds, and after a few more drinks, we were back to it, getting on with having a great night. Eventually, at around 1 AM I think, we called it a night. The bars were closed, the crowd in the club had started to trickle down, and with all of us now being in our 30s, none of us had the stamina to stay out much later. After waiting for what felt like an age in the cold of the taxi rank, we clambered into the first free one and made our way back home. Claire, Emily and Dan all lived on the edge of town, each departing the taxi one after the other and paying their fee, before the driver set off towards the countryside, back to my house. I'd only recently moved into it. It was a lovely old farmhouse just outside of town, surrounded by fields. I'd always loved the idea of living in the country, but in situations like this, it was a bit of a hindrance, as it meant I'd need to pay more for my ride. Still, nothing beats waking up to the view of rolling hills and lush woods each morning. Pulling to a stop in my driveway, I paid the driver and stumbled out of the car. Staggering across the path towards my front door, I mumbled a drunken thanks over my shoulder. I'd not felt too bad in the taxi, but the cool night air made me realise exactly how drunk I actually was. My vision was swimming as I made my way along the dark path, and my legs threatened to give way at any second. Behind me, I heard the crunch of tyres on gravel as the taxi pulled away, leaving me alone in front of my home. Meandering along to the front door, I leaned against it, allowing it to take my weight as I fumbled with the key. My hands seemed to experience a delay, taking a few seconds to respond to my commands, which made putting the small key in the small lock an arduous task. Eventually, after a couple of failed attempts, I heard the familiar sound of sliding metal as the key finally slid in and the lock released with a click. Clumsily pushing the door open, I staggered inside. The house was dark, and something about the stillness of it all made a twinge of discomfort crawl along my back. I'd not long moved in. I'd only got the keys a couple of weeks ago, and even then it took me another week to finally move everything in properly, so it still didn't quite feel like home. Closing the door behind me, I fumbled the key in the lock again before bumbling along the darkened hallway. Clambering up the stairs on all fours, I dragged myself to my bedroom, not even bothering to change out of my clothes before flopping down and passing out on the bed. I didn't know how long I'd been asleep for. It felt like hardly any time at all, when a blinding bright light pierced my eyes, snapping me awake. I blinked, frantically, squinting hard against the sting in my retina. It took several seconds for my eyes to adjust to the bright light. My head was fuzzy, my vision still swimming slightly with the remnants of drunkenness, still not quite having worked their way out of my system. The light pounding in my temples brought with it the threat of the impending hangover I knew was on its way. As though nothing more than a dream, the events of last night slowly started coming back to me. Most of them anyway. But something didn't feel right. I was still fully clothed, but it was freezing. I didn't recognize what I was seeing as my still slightly drunk brain tried to catch up with my eyes. I was lying flat on my front, just as I had been when I passed out. Only rather than the soft covers of my bed and pillow, something soft and green seemed to be tickling my nose and side of my face. The bright light seemed to shrink back as my eyes finally focused, revealing what looked like blades of grass reaching towards me. With a great effort, I raised my head, the pounding in my temples intensifying. It was grass, surrounding me on all sides. The blades flattened where I'd been lying on them. Some of them had stuck to my face. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, taking in my surroundings as my confusion grew. I was outside. I'd been lying face first on my front lawn for I don't know how long. Long enough to leave a distinct imprint in the grass. The bright light that broke through the overcast sky above me had roused me from sleep. How long had I been out here? I could see my house just ahead of me. Behind me was a road bordering my property, and the woods on the other side. Further off to my left was the fence, leading off to my neighbour, Bart Penton's property in the distance. How had I gotten out here? I know I was drunk last night, and although it was hazy, I could remember climbing the staircase to bed. Unless I was that drunk I just passed out on the front lawn after the taxi left? Maybe I dreamt of actually going to bed. Embarrassment burnt at my cheeks just thinking about it. I'd never done anything like this before. Sure, I'd drank that much that I'd passed out before, mainly when I was a teenager. But that had always been at my house, or a friend's house. I'd always managed to make it back inside at the very least. I thanked my lucky stars that I wasn't still living in my old house. I had no idea what I would have said to the neighbours. Thankfully, as this house was in the country, and although there wasn't a huge amount of land separating it from the nearest dwelling, there was still more than enough to prevent Bart from noticing my awkward sleeping arrangement. Forcing myself to my feet, and still staggering a little, I brushed off the stray blades of grass. My head was pounding harder now that I was supporting my own weight, and I knew the hangover would soon be upon me with full force. I needed to get inside and get a coffee, a shower, and some paracetamol. Stumbling back to the front door, my joints aching from resting on such an uncomfortable surface for such a long time, I tried my key in the lock. Twisting it to unlock the door, the key didn't budge. Raising an eyebrow in confusion, I tried again, twisting a little harder this time. The key still wouldn't move, a firm resistance pressing against it. Now even more confused, I reached for the handle. Turning it, the door opened smoothly, leading to the hallway within, illuminated only by the morning sunlight. Surely if I'd dreamt going to bed, I wouldn't have unlocked the door. Perplexed, the only thing I could think was that I must have made it to the door and unlocked it last night before passing out. But then, why I would have chosen to go back out onto the lawn and pass out, rather than just open the door and go into the house, was beyond me. Trying to pick apart my drunken thoughts would have been an exercise in futility. With my hangover now ramping up in intensity, the allure of coffee and painkillers became too hard to resist. I made my way inside, closing the door behind me, and tried to forget about last night's embarrassment. I went about the rest of my day, albeit with a subdued attitude that comes with being hungover. The rest of the day came and went uneventfully, although my thoughts kept on drifting back to how I'd woken up this morning. I couldn't believe it. I was in my 30s. That was something you'd have expected from a teenager, not a fully grown adult. The pounding in my head seemed determined not to give up, and I began to dread that it might be a 2-day hangover. I'd only experienced them a couple of times, but each time I remember wanting to die. In an attempt to speed up my recovery, I went to bed earlier that evening, the sun barely even sinking below the horizon before I crawled under my covers. Thankfully, sleep came quickly, likely due to the restless sleep I must have endured last night face down on the lawn. Before I knew it, my eyelids were closed and I was fast away. Waking with a start, a bright light pierced my eyes, burning away the vestiges of rest. Much like yesterday, I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for, but the light seemed too bright to be seeping through my curtains. Squinting to avoid the stinging of the light, blurred shapes slowly came into focus. A cool chill worked its way along my spine as my eyes registered my surroundings. I was lying face down again, the light from above me beating down and illuminating the area. The hard surface beneath me was a dull brown, not like the soft blue of my bed covers, or even the lush green of my front lawn. Around me, I could see piles of browning leaves, brushed away into small piles to reveal the snaking of thick tree roots worming their way through the floor. Thick trunks were visible just beyond them, reaching upwards towards the clear sky, their canopy obscuring the sunlight slightly. Flabbergasted, I pushed myself into a sitting position and scanned around, not quite believing what I was seeing. I was outside again. How the hell was I outside again? I'd not passed out this time. There was no way I'd dreamt of going to bed. Everywhere I looked, large, old trees seemed to loom over me, pressing in around me almost menacingly. I shivered, realizing just how cold I actually was. God knows how long I've been lying there in the dirt in nothing but my pajamas, the ground chill working its icy fingers through me. Panic set in as my eyes darted around wildly. Where was I? Everywhere looked the same. I was obviously in some kind of woods, but how had I gotten here? Trying to regain control of my slowly spiraling thoughts, I got to my feet and looked for anything that might help me. Trying to think logically, the only thing that came to mind was that I must have sleepwalked. I vividly remembered going to bed last night, so the only explanation for waking up in the woods was that I'd walked out here in my sleep. I'd never sleepwalked before, even as a child, but it was the only thing that made any semblance of sense. And if I had sleepwalked, the only forest within walking distance was the woods outside my house. Scanning around again for anything familiar, hope soared in me as I made out the bough of a large oak tree in the distance, split down the middle by a lightning strike several years before. It was heavily obscured by the thick trunks of several of the trees, a good distance away from me. I remembered seeing that tree from my bedroom window, almost on the horizon. I must have walked for ages. With a landmark to work with, I began to feel a little better. At least now knowing the direction I needed to go. I needed to get home. I was freezing, and my feet were stinging from the uncomfortable bumps and jabs from the roots beneath them. About to make my way through the dense woods back towards my house, when I stopped dead. Looking at the ground beneath me, I'd not really paid much attention to it before, but there were marks in the dirt. The obvious, sweeping indentations of fingers being dragged along, congregating the piles of leaves at the edge of this small clearing. Had I cleared the area to make a bed for myself? As I stared at them, confused, another shape caught my eye, and the blood drained from my face. It was difficult to see, obscured and broken by the roots that coated the floor. But I swear I could see what looked like the imprint of a boot in the dirt. Staring down at my own feet, they were bare. Had someone else been here? No, that was crazy. I lived on my own out in the sticks. The only person nearby would be Bart, and why would he be out here? Heck, at his age I doubt he'd even be able to walk to my house, let alone this deep into the woods. Something didn't feel right about this. I looked around again, calling out, half expecting a figure to emerge from behind one of the trees. The thick woods seemed leering and oppressive now, as though the canopy above me was slowly closing in. Clothed in only my pajamas, without so much as a pair of shoes, I suddenly became aware of how vulnerable I was. With no one else for miles around me, and defenseless like this. If someone had dragged me out here to do God knows what, then no one would know, and there would be no one to help me. Averting my gaze from the boot print, I made my way through the still woods, picking up as much speed as my protesting feet would allow. I needed to get home, the dried leaves and concealed twigs stabbing at my soles as I crushed them underfoot. I ignored the pain as best as I could. I just wanted to get home. After what felt like hours of walking, I could finally see it. Obscured by the tree line, the shape of my house bolstered my resolve and I charged on, bursting from the woods and out onto the road. I'd never been so relieved to feel solid tarmac beneath my feet before. Rushing across it and onto the soft grass of my front lawn, all I could think of was getting inside where it was safe. I charged across my front lawn, climbing the front steps 2 at a time, reaching my hand out for the handle, relief filling me knowing that I was so close now. But that relief was short-lived. As I reached the top of the steps, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was ajar. I knew it must just have been me. That if I'd sleepwalked out into the woods, then I'd have had to unlock my door to get out. But I couldn't shake the image of the boot print that I'd seen. What if someone had been there? What if they'd come back here after leaving me in the woods? I knew it was a stupid thought, that the boot print could have been there for who knows how long, but I couldn't get it out of my head. Gingerly pushing the door open, the dim hallway came into view. Where it had once felt cozy and inviting, it now seemed to have taken on a more hostile demeanour, the light exaggerating the shadows. It was as though this was a place where I was no longer welcome. A strange feeling washed over me, almost one of violation at the idea that someone might have been here without me knowing, working their way through my house while I slept, before dragging me out into those woods for who knows what reason. Quietly, I slipped inside, my senses keen to any kind of sound, half expecting to catch a subtle movement from the corner of my eye. Slowly and quietly, I made my way to the kitchen. All the while my eyes were darting from side to side. I was unarmed and in my pyjamas. Although the idea of someone being in my house was almost far-fetched, the oppressive energy that bombarded me caused the hairs on my neck to stand on end. If someone had dragged me out into the woods and returned here, then I at least wanted to be able to defend myself. Scooping up a knife from the block in the kitchen, I made my way around as quietly as I could, moving carefully from room to room, tentatively peering around doors and checking even the smallest cupboards for any sign of disturbance. Thankfully, the ground floor was empty. Everything was as I had left it the night before. Gingerly climbing the stairs, I winced as they screeched under my weight. I'd not lived here that long, so I couldn't remember which of the old steps creaked. If there was anyone here, they would have certainly heard that. Ascending to the landing, I decided there was no use in trying to be stealthy anymore. Not after the stairs had given my presence away. I shouted into the silence of the house, urging anyone up there to come out now, and that I was armed. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears as I stood there, dreading what might come next. After several painful seconds of silence, I knew that if there was someone up here, they weren't going to come out willingly. Gripping the knife tighter, I started to make my way into each of the upstairs rooms, bursting through the doors so as not to give a potential intruder time to act. Each of the rooms seemed as empty as I'd left them the previous night. Boxes of my possessions were piled up in the spare room as I'd left them. The bathroom was untouched, and my bedroom was just the same as it had always been, the covers disturbed from where I must have gotten out of bed the night before. I searched them all thoroughly, scouring them from top to bottom, looking for anywhere that anyone could feasibly hide. There was nothing. They were each as empty and deserted as the last. There was no one else in the house. Just me, here, alone. Still, even with that knowledge, I couldn't relax. If there was no one here, then I must have sleepwalked out into the woods last night. It was a miracle I'd not injured myself or made myself sick from exposure. Now that we were heading towards winter, being outside all night in my pyjamas was a surefire way of freezing to death. Sheepishly returning the kitchen knife to the block downstairs, I proceeded to shower in an attempt to warm myself up again. Getting changed into some fresh clothes, I made myself some breakfast and tried my best to distract myself from my whirling thoughts. Ultimately, it was futile. Every little noise from the old wood of the house settling caused me to jump with a start. The feeling of being watched by something just outside of the doorway set me on edge, and I would whirl around, expecting to see someone standing there, just inches behind me. My mind, deep in its paranoid state, was jumping from thought to thought in an erratic pattern that was making my head spin. I was making connections where there were none, trying to make sense of what was going on. Sleepwalking seemed like the most obvious answer. But as though that wasn't a good enough reason for what was happening, the story the estate agent told me about this place wormed its way to the front of my mind. One of the reasons I'd bought this place was because of its age. I loved old buildings, the way they still stood strong against the ravages of time. They always had such unique histories, silent sentinels observing the ages marching by. This particular house had been built around 300 years ago, and I was eager to uncover the secrets it held. When I asked about the history of the house, the estate agent, a young man in his early 20s called Carl, had relayed some mundane information about the previous owners. The standard facts that they gave to prospective buyers who were only concerned about whether they'd kept it in acceptable condition or not. When Carl saw my nonplussed expression, he must have realised what I was expecting to hear. Glancing around to check that no one would overhear us, he leaned in closer to me, as though discussing something that would land him a prison sentence if he wasn't careful. Okay, look, take this with a pinch of salt, as no one's ever been able to verify it. And I really shouldn't be telling you this, but there is a story about this place. Well, it's more of a local legend, really. But like I said, there's nothing to base it on, so please don't think anything of it. A nervous smile spread across his face as he said that last part, as though worried that by telling me this legend, he'd be jeopardizing his potential sale. I smiled at him in what I hoped was a reassuring way, and nodded, bidding him to continue. He seemed to relax slightly before going on to explain. The legend went that shortly after the house was built, a famine swept the area. One of the previous owners, an old farmer by the name of William Tuck, barely survived, losing his entire family to it. Having invested all of his money into the failing farm, and being too frail to venture into town to get aid, there was no way that the old man could get them to the church to bury them. This was before the town was as large as it is now. Even Bart's house had not been built, and it was several miles before the nearest neighbour. The legend went that the old man, stricken by grief and lapsing into madness at surviving his offspring, dragged them out into the woods bordering the property. No one knows how far into the woods he went, but when he came back, he was alone. They say he buried them out in the woods before trudging back to the house. When his neighbours went to check on him a few weeks later, after no one had heard from him around the town, they found a trail of muddy footprints leading up to the front door, the door itself wide open, and a dirty shovel resting against the outside wall. When they entered the house, the stench hit them, sickly sweet and foul. It was billowing down from the open attic. Old William was hanging from the rafters, his body already heavily in the throes of decay. Again, there's absolutely no proof that any of that really happened. Just local stories. So please don't pay it any mind, Carl said to me, almost immediately regretting humouring me. I'd thought that it was an interesting tale at the time. A story that gave the place a bit of character. And as people had lived here since then, there was obviously nothing wrong with it. But now I couldn't help but take it a little more seriously. If the legend was true, could that perhaps have somehow tainted the place? I'd not noticed anything wrong since moving in. There had been nothing out of the ordinary at all in the week I'd been here. Normally when you hear people talk about ghosts, they talk about things moving and sounds that go bump in the night. But there had been nothing of any kind. No, I was being stupid. That story was made up. Probably by one of the townspeople to drive the price of the house down and scare away any prospective buyers, so they could swoop in and get the land for next to nothing. An elaborate legend that spread through the town back then as an entertaining story for the bored locals. I was becoming irrational. I needed someone to help ground me. Pulling my phone out of my pocket, I dropped Claire a message on WhatsApp. I decided against putting anything in our group chat, as I knew there would be no end to the teasing Dan would decide my story warranted. Claire tended to be a good listener, so I thought she would be my best bet. It didn't take her long to respond, and, much as I'd hoped, her reaction was one of concern rather than mockery. She said that it was probably sleepwalking, like I suspected, and that it might be worth me seeing a doctor, as well as hiding my front door keys somewhere unusual before I went to bed, so that my asleep self couldn't find them. When I mentioned the boot print in the woods when I'd woken up this morning, she agreed that it was a bit odd, but thought, much as I did, that it was probably just an old print from a hiker or something. Yeah, it's probably an old print. Or then again, maybe this is all that creep from the bar the other night trying to mess with you. I didn't understand what she was talking about initially. Although it was only a couple of days ago that we went out for her birthday, it felt like a lifetime had passed. And then it came to me. Whatever, that dude was a dick. Besides, he'd have to have waited outside for, 6 hours? And then tailed me back to my place? And then broken in and dragged me out into the woods. He didn't seem clever enough for that. Haha, yeah. That arsehole could barely string 2 words together sober. Still, he did say, "You don't know who you're messing with." He obviously meant he was an expert stalker and cat burglar. It's the only explanation, Claire replied, embellishing the response with a winking emoji. I appreciated her trying to cheer me up. In all the years we'd been friends, she was always the best person to speak to when something was on your mind. She had an innate, caring nature that really shone through. We talked for a little while longer, and I found myself gradually calming down, my thoughts becoming more rational and less scared. Eventually, as the day went on, the sun sank in the sky, indicating that it was time for bed again. Although I was now pretty certain that there had been no one there last night, I completed another precautionary sweep of the house again, just in case. I passed from room to room, my trusty kitchen knife in hand, ready to find someone hiding in a tiny cupboard or something, just waiting for me to close my eyes and go to sleep. When I found nothing, I returned the knife and made my way upstairs to my room, getting ready for bed, safe in the knowledge that the house was empty. I propped a chair in front of my bedroom door, hoping that it would be too much of an obstacle for me to overcome if I was asleep, before sliding under my covers. Although the thought of sleepwalking and waking up in those woods again filled me with dread, eventually I found myself slipping into a dreamless sleep. I jolted awake, gasping, the air around me thick and moist. Something heavy pressed down on me from all angles, forcing me flat against the cold surface beneath. The dense pressure above me crushed the wind out of me with each struggling breath. I tried to move my head, to look over my shoulder, but it was held firmly in place, squashed still. Panicked, my wide eyes whirled around in their sockets, trying to find the source of the pressure. I couldn't make out a thing, just an inky abyss as far as I could see. I tried bringing my arms up, but the weight pinned them firmly in place. Something cold and solid, like some kind of wall, stopped me from stretching them out at the sides. The only thing I could move was my fingers. As I wiggled each of them, all I could feel was something soft and cold working its way between them like falling sand as I struggled in vain. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. What the hell was going on? Where was I? What was crushing me? Had I been sleepwalking again and gotten myself stuck somewhere maybe? I didn't like this. I'd never been good with small spaces and being confined, especially not in the dark. The air felt clammy, stinking of my own hot breath as well as a damp, earthy stench. My breathing quickened, verging on hyperventilating. I wasn't getting any oxygen. Although I was breathing fast, my lungs seemed to tighten with each inhale, causing a stinging pain to flare up in my chest. I needed to get out of here, wherever here was. I tried to wriggle my head free from the crushing weight and turn it around. I pushed as hard as I could, straining the muscles in my neck to the point that I thought something was going to tear or burst. But it wouldn't budge. Defeated, I dropped my head back down, my neck sore from the exertion, and felt the cold trickle of something sliding across my face. The mouldy stench of earth intensified as something foul-tasting and grainy fell into my mouth. I screamed, or at least tried my best to. That flare in my lungs burning even hotter, causing me to wince in pain. Frantically, I began struggling, flailing my arms and legs against whatever held them, trying my best to move them in the little space they had. Pushing myself as hard as I could against the crushing weight above me, I felt that same feeling of cold slithering sand sliding around me. moving with the desperate thrashing of my body. The air grew hotter as I wrestled for breath, my panicked writhing making my laboured breathing even harder. I was suffocating. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew if I didn't get out of here soon, I was going to die. By some miracle, although I have no idea how, I somehow managed to get my arms underneath my chest, the unrelenting weight seemingly shifting in response to my thrashing. I tensed as hard as I could, shoving my back with all my might against the weight above it, my arms burning with the exertion. Then a fire of hope ignited within me. I felt the weight above me shift slightly, weakening under my desperate efforts. Spluttering from the stuffy, stale air forcing its way into me with each breath and the searing sensation that accompanied it, the foul, grainy substance spilt down from above me with each push. It was piling around my hands now, like a grainy sea covering them with its cold, earthy weight. The stench of mould and wet dirt was unbearable. My throat was burning. I needed air. Still, that ray of hope shone through. I forced myself back harder, shoving myself against the weight above me with every last ounce of strength that I had. My arms burned and my back ached with the pressure fighting against me, but I had to keep going. I could feel the weight relenting, easing gradually with that trickling feeling, until it weakened enough that I was able to force myself backwards with one final effort. All at once, the weight slid away, no longer able to hold me down as I broke free from whatever had covered me. Bursting up into a kneeling position, it felt so good to be upright. I felt that trickling feeling working its way down my face and body, slowly falling away as though it was being pulled back into whatever mass I'd just broken free from. It was replaced by the cool movement of a gentle breeze licking at my exposed face and hands. Gulping down breath after breath, my lungs burned as the beautiful cold air filled them, but I didn't care. Glaring sunlight stung my eyes as I blinked frantically, trying to make sense of these new surroundings. The sense of hope and elation that came with this new freedom was short-lived, however, as my eyes slowly adjusted. A chill slithered down my spine as the familiar pile of leaves from yesterday came into view. I was in the same clearing that I'd sleepwalked into last night. Looking down, ice filled my veins. Rather than just having fallen to sleep on the cold dirt floor like last night, I appeared to be kneeling in what looked like freshly turned soil. I stared at my arms and legs. They were coated in a thick layer of dirt, as though I'd been rolling around in the stuff. That cold, trickling feeling. That weight. It was dirt moving around me. Above me. Feverishly whirling around, I could see the extent of the hole that I was currently kneeling in. Around 2 feet deep, most of it covered with fresh soil. It stretched out for around 7 feet. Someone had buried me alive. There was no way I could have done this while sleepwalking. No way that I could have dug a hole this deep and somehow buried myself in it all while unconscious. The hair on my neck stood on end as I feverishly scanned around the tree line, expecting to see whoever was responsible standing there, inches away, watching me. The woods were as still and as empty as the day before. The trees eerily still despite the breeze in the air. I was alone, or at least as far as I was aware. The canopy above me seemed to leer down oppressively, and that feeling of vulnerability from yesterday morning came crashing down on me again. Although I'd escaped the crushing weight of the dirt burying me alive, I still felt equally as trapped as I had under the soil. Someone was trying to kill me, and when they noticed I'd broken free from my shallow grave, it would be all too easy for them to finish me off. I was defenseless. The sound of my blood aggressively flowing filled my ears with each pounding heartbeat. As I furtively glanced around again, all too aware that I was sitting here, half in the dirt, only in my pajamas, my eyes locked onto something on the ground near the edge of the hole that made bile rise in my throat. A boot print. The same boot print as I'd seen yesterday. The same boot print that I'd convinced myself had been left in the clearing ages ago was now looking back at me from the edge of the hole, embedded in the freshly turned dirt. A bolt of fear shocked its way along my nerves as I stumbled back, away from the print, my mind whirling. Whoever had buried me here dragged me out here last night too. They probably tried to drag me out here the night before that as well, but left me on my front lawn for some reason. Maybe they'd been disturbed. But still, they'd somehow broken into my house, dragged me into the woods without waking me, placed me into the hole, and buried me, all while I slept oblivious. How long had they been watching me? How had they gotten in? Dazed by the thoughts writhing around in my head, I felt sick. Dragging myself from the hole, my legs barely held my weight as a wave of nausea washed over me. Stumbling as the dirt fell from me, I charged through the woods barefoot, the dead leaves and broken twigs stabbing into the soles of my feet as I crushed them. Weaving in and out of the trees, I charged towards the edge of the forest, away from the site of my burial. I needed to get out of here. I needed to go home, to call the police. My ears were pricked, open to the sounds around me, half expecting to hear the crashing of heavy boots gaining on me through the undergrowth. My head was on a swivel, my terrified eyes darting left and right, scrutinizing each tree that I passed with the expectation of a hooded figure jumping out ready to finish what they'd started. My heart pounded in my ears with each step I took. The searing pain in my feet was screaming at me to stop, to slow down. But all I could think about was getting out of there, getting home where I could be safe. As I got closer to the edge of the woods, the familiar brick of my house slowly became visible through the dense trees. Hope soared within me at the sight, urging me on, faster and faster. I was so nearly there, so nearly safe. Bursting through the tree line and out onto the main road, I stopped dead, my hope crashing and burning as I stared at my home. The front door was open, wide open. Along the path leading up to it, and clearly visible on the steps of my porch, were large, muddy boot prints. I didn't need to get any closer to know that they were the same boot prints that I'd seen in the woods only a few minutes ago. The boot prints of whoever was doing this to me. Whoever had buried me was in my house. They'd come back here after they'd finished. For all I knew, they could very well still be there right now. A bright reflection stung my eyes as I beheld the sight before me, dumbfounded. I raised my hand to block it out, my eyes moving to its source. Leaning against the side of the house, as though in stoic vigil, was an old shovel. Sunlight was reflecting off one of the screws holding the handle in place, leaving spots in my vision. The blade of the shovel was brown, coated with a layer of fresh dirt as though it had not long been used. Seeing the shovel resting there, I turned and ran. sprinting along the rough tarmac of the road. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I couldn't go back inside. The way it had all looked, it was too familiar. Too much like the story the estate agent had told me. After racing down the road for a few miles, I managed to make it to Bart's house. The soles of my feet, no longer hurting, were now completely numb. A cocktail of adrenaline and trauma had rendered them unfazed by the coarse road beneath me and the crunching gravel of Bart's driveway. Knocking on the door, he answered, a terrified expression crossing his face as he beheld my current state. He ushered me inside, letting me use his phone, and I called the police. After thoroughly searching my house, the police found nothing to indicate that there had been a break-in, nor that anyone was there at all after I'd crawled out of the woods. They couldn't explain the boot prints, nor how the shovel got there, but they said that it could have potentially been something I'd done myself while asleep, if I'd been sleepwalking. They also told me that I might want to call the RSPCA, as they thought that something might have died in my loft. They couldn't find anything up there, but the smell was apparently unbearable. I'm writing this from my friend's computer, as I'm not staying in that house for another night. I need help. I don't know what's happening. I have no idea if this is all that guy from the bar trying to mess with me, although I don't know how he's doing all this, or if this is one of the locals trying to force me out using that story the estate agent told me. Then again, that story had to have come from somewhere. What if it was real, and the old man's trying to bury me in the woods just like his family? What if whoever's doing this is following me? It's progressively gotten worse the past 3 nights, and I don't want to go to sleep anymore. I struggled to get out of that grave this morning. What happens next time if they decide to dig deeper? Hey guys, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really appreciate each and every one of you watching. If you enjoyed this story, please feel free to check out my other videos for more original horror content. I've also released a full-length novel based on my That Church is Abandoned for a Reason story. It's available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. I've popped a link in the description. Check it out if you enjoyed my work. Thanks again for listening. Until our next descent into the darkness, remember, it's never just a story.